The weathered cattleman rode into town beneath a sun that offered no kindness to weary souls on that dusty afternoon. He tied his horse to a hitching post outside the mercantile and let silence speak his weary greetings to the town. Inside the store, he heard a commotion near the saloon where men gathered like vultures around something small and broken. He stepped out and saw a girl on a wooden crate with a sign pinned to her thin, faded dress of sorrow. She looked no older than 12, with tangled hair and eyes that held the weight of 1,000 unspoken betrayals. A man in a stained hat called for bids on the girl, who stared at the dirt with hollow resignation and despair. The rancher's calloused fingers curled into fists as he listened to the crass laughter from the crowd of greedy traders. He counted the coins in his pouch and knew it was every last cent he had saved for winter supplies and hope. Without a word, he pushed through the men and placed his entire pouch on the barrel beside the trembling, discarded child. The auctioneer grinned and declared the weathered stranger the new owner of the discarded child without a name or past. She flinched when he reached for her, but he only untied the rope from her wrist with surprising gentleness and care. He lifted her onto his horse, and they rode away from the jeering crowd into the open emptiness of fragrant sagebrush. For hours they traveled in silence, and she never once looked up at the man who now held her fragile fate. They reached a hidden valley where a small cabin sat beside a creek that sang a lullaby to the ancient stones. He dismounted and lifted her down carefully, and then led his horse to the stable without a spoken command or explanation. She stood motionless in the yard, as if waiting for the next transaction that would define her miserable existence once more. The rancher returned with a tin cup of cool water and held it out until she finally took a trembling sip of trust. He pointed to the cabin door and gestured that she should go inside, where there was a fire and clean folded blankets. She stepped into the single room that smelled of pine and leather, and for the first time felt no eyes appraising her. He showed her a bed he had made from split logs, with a quilt stitched by someone long since buried in the clay. She sat on the edge and dared to touch the fabric, while he busied himself stoking the stove with split juniper and patience. That night, he cooked beans and salt pork and set a plate before her without expecting any thanks or spoken gratitude from her. She ate slowly at first and then devoured the food while he sat on the porch staring at a starry blanket of night. Days passed in that rhythm of work and silence, where she learned his language was action, not idle chatter or hollow promises. He mended her dress with a needle and thread, and she watched his thick fingers move with surprising delicacy and intention. She began to follow him to the barn, where he let her brush the old mare's mane until it gleamed like polished silk. He carved a small wooden bird from a piece of willow and placed it on her pillow without a single word of explanation. One morning, she found a pair of boots by her bed that fit her feet and were lined with soft rabbit fur inside. She wore them outside and stood taller, even though she still never spoke a single word in his quiet, thoughtful presence. The rancher named the nameless creek and pointed to the mountains and called them the guardians of their shared hidden sanctuary. He taught her to mend fences and to read the weather in the shape of clouds that drifted over the granite peaks. When a rattlesnake coiled near the woodpile, he dispatched it with a shovel and then showed her how to stay safe forevermore. She realized he never asked for her story and never demanded payment and never looked at her with a sense of ownership. One evening, a rider came into the valley claiming the girl had been stolen and he intended to reclaim his supposed property. The rancher stepped between the rider and the girl, with nothing but a rifle held loosely and his weathered but steady side. He spoke his first full sentence in days and said, "She is not property. She is under my protection now and always will be." The rider laughed and drew his pistol, but the rancher fired a warning shot that split the wood of the porch with thunder. The intruder cursed and rode away, and the girl clutched the rancher's sleeve with the first real trust she had ever willingly given. After that, the valley felt like a fortress where the silence was a prayer and the wind was a watchful sentinel over them. She began to hum while gathering eggs, and the sound floated through the cabin like a bird returning to its long-lost nest. He built her a window box, and she planted wildflower seeds that bloomed in a riot of orange and purple under the sun. One night by the fire, he rolled up his sleeve and showed her a brand on his forearm from a past he never spoke aloud. She traced the scar with a fingertip and understood that he too had been sold once as a commodity of labor and pain. It whispered that freedom is not given but carved out of rock and thorn, an endless stubborn hope that never fades. She finally spoke her first word, and it was his name which she had never known until that exact moment of sacred closeness. He told her his name was Elias, and she said it again like a blessing over the quiet cabin and the listening stars. She asked if she could stay forever, and he nodded once because a man of few words can promise the entire world. Seasons turned the valley golden and then white, and she learned to shoot a rifle and ride a horse bareback with confidence. Elias carved a sign for the gate that read Sanctuary Ranch, and she painted the letters with a careful brush of belonging. Neighbors came to trade and saw a girl who laughed now and whose eyes held the fire of a rising desert sun. They called it the Miracle Valley, and Elias just shrugged and went back to mending a bridle without comment or need for praise. She told him she wanted to learn to read, so he rode 3 days to buy a primer and a slate board and chalk. By the next spring, she could recite poetry from a tattered book while he listened and nodded with quiet, barely hidden pride. One day, a letter arrived from the town offering money for the girl, but Elias burned it in the stove without a reply. She realized that his calloused hands had built not just walls, but a fortress against a world that sold souls for profit. When she turned 16, he gave her a deed to a portion of the land signed with his rough mark and hers together. She cried for the first time since her mother died, and he simply handed her a handkerchief made of clean, soft white cotton. He taught her that sanctuary is not just a place, but a state of being where silence can be the loudest love of all. She began teaching other lost children who wandered into the valley how to trust and how to hold a hammer with steady purpose. Elias grew older, and his hair turned the color of winter sage, but his quiet strength never once diminished or wavered at all. She called him father once, and he turned away to hide the trembling of his chin, but she saw his joy like morning light. Years later, when a journalist came seeking stories of the frontier, he found a ranch where children sang and thrived in pure peace. The reporter asked Elias how a silent man built such a legacy, and the old rancher simply pointed at the girl with pride. She stood surrounded by sunflowers and spoke for him, saying, "He gave me a home when the world sold me away for nothing." The article called it the sanctuary of the discarded, but the girl corrected it to the sanctuary of belonging and of choice. Elias died in the valley with the creek whispering his name, and she buried him beneath the tallest ponderosa pine on the ridge. She continued his work, and every year she planted a new tree so that his silence would become a forest of endless shelter. The story spread across the territory of the weathered cattleman who traded isolation for the redemption of a child nobody wanted. His calloused hands became a legend, and the fragile peace of that valley proved the loudest sanctuary of all on the frontier. A man of few words built something eternal, and she carried his name on the gate for the rest of her blessed days. Now, when you ride through that hidden valley, you can still hear the echo of a hammer and the laughter of saved children. The weathered rancher's silence still rings louder than any sermon, and that discarded girl became the keeper of 100 second chances. So remember that a calloused hand can shape a soul, and the quietest man can build a sanctuary that outlasts all the noise.